Okay, hi, and welcome to our podcast on infant mental health and thinking about babies. I'm Nicole Kanan, and I'm with my colleague Nikki Dawson. We are both psychologists with an interest and kind of specialization in infant mental health, both on the executive of the Gauteng Association of Infant Mental Health, and we're going to have a discussion about babies. We thought we'd start with thinking about development, because we know that many parents worry about whether their baby is getting enough from the environment, enough stimulation, enough focus, enough what's going to support healthy development. Nikki, maybe we could start. And we know that there's been a huge amount of research in brain development, and I know that that's a particular interest of yours. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the research is saying. What is it that babies need?
Yeah, so I think as you're saying, a lot of parents have questions about how to stimulate their babies and what colors to show them and when they need to start school and those kind of things. But I think what's been so fascinating about the field of infant mental health and of neuroscience in infancy is that really prenatally in the last trimester and then through the first kind of 2 years of life, so the first 1,000 days really, I guess, from pregnancy through the first 2 years of life, the primary area of the brain that is developing is the right brain. And really what that
Maybe
means is the kind
what
of,
the right brain does.
yeah.
Sorry.
So that's really the kind of social emotional part of our brain, the part of our brain that helps us with relationships and emotions. And I guess another big part of the brain that's really developing and being wired in that time is our stress regulation system. So something, a kind of fancy term is the HPA axis. But these kind of important parts of our brain are being wired during this time. And they specifically the parts of our brain that help us to cope with emotions and stress, and to know how to calm down. And what we call regulate, so calm down or kind of come back to a state of being okay when we're feeling not okay, too angry or too scared or too upset. And then also the parts of our brain that kind of really help us to understand human relationships, whether or not people will be helpful to us, how to read facial expressions to know when somebody is trustworthy and kind and approachable. So it's these areas of our brains really that are being wired first.
So in other words, you're saying that our early experiences are actually setting us up, even physically in terms of the brain, the parts of our brain that develops, really for the rest of our lives. It sounds like what you're saying.
So we also know that the brain is most plastic. And I guess what that means is like most wireable or most able to be wired or take in information from the environment and use that information when we are a baby. And the older we get, the more we rely on experiences that we've had before and the less we wire new experiences into our brain. So we do still learn from new experiences, but we do it much less than when we're a baby. And I think you can kind of think about it like when we're a baby, it's like our brain is like the open felt. And the first few experiences we have in relationships and with emotions in infancy are really the first pathways that get walked through the felt, and they get walked over and over again. And they start to become the most kind of easily walkable pathway in a way. And so our brain will use that pathway the most often, if that makes sense.
So how should parents use this information? What does it mean for parenting in terms of what can they do to help their babies' brains develop in the ways that you're speaking about?
So I think one of the most important things that it tells us is it kind of contradicts this idea that managing your emotions is about kind of leaving babies to be by themselves, to kind of get over themselves, or the ideas of time out and things like that. Even it kind of challenges those kinds of ideas, because I guess what this neuro research shows us is that really babies need help learning how to manage emotions and learning how to be in relationships. And the way that they actually learn to manage their emotions independently as an adult, or interdependently, the way that they learn to kind of ask for help when they need help, is through kind of people walking that route through the felt of their brain with them really young and really early. So really taking them through the process of calming down. So I guess one of the most central things that parents can do for their children in the early years is really help them to calm down when they're distressed. So to try and kind of notice their distress signals and offer themselves as a really kind of calm, regulating, I guess is the word we would use, kind of a calming, soothing presence for their babies.
So it really challenges this idea that some people worry about, that they're going to spoil their babies, that they're going to give them too much attention or calm them down and make them too needy. I think a lot of parents report being worried about that. Don't pick up your baby too much, because then it's going to need you more.
Yeah, and actually it's really the opposite, actually, is when we don't kind of help babies in this kind of way, they don't know how to do it for themselves. But the more we help them with it, the more they do know how to do it for themselves. So the calmer they'll be kind of in life generally as they grow up. Whereas babies who don't have these early experiences of being calmed and soothed are more likely to get kind of upset or struggle to calm down as they grow up.
Right. So if you were to give parents a kind of few parenting takeaways, kind of lessons to take away from this and to maybe think about a little bit, what would you say would be the most important messages?
Yeah. So I think the first would be kind of around comforting your baby when your baby needs comforting. And that will help them to learn how to comfort themselves, and to seek out appropriate sources of comfort as an adult. And that's really the foundation, I think, of all mental health. Is, can you kind of manage your emotions in a helpful way? I mean, I think the other important thing, though, about infant mental health research is that, in a way, it really, an important aspect of it is that parents are feeling confident and capable, and not getting overwhelmed or dysregulated, I guess that word again, themselves. So, or that when they are seeking help and support. So I guess it's a model really that says babies need comfort and support and help, but so do parents. And so getting kind of critical of yourself and of your failures, or of your, times when you felt like you failed, or when you felt like you didn't do a good enough job, is also not helpful, actually. So I think it's really about being quite forgiving and comforting and soothing of yourself as well is an important
Right.
aspect of it.
I mean, a lot of the research is showing that, in fact, it isn't about getting it right all the time. In fact, that's not helpful for baby in any way. That it's about that there will be ruptures and there will be times when it doesn't go exactly right, but that there's something in the repair they talk about, in terms of when mothers can make it right rather than expecting it all to be perfect. Because I think some of this stuff can make moms quite anxious.
Absolutely. And I think that's, that's an important kind of aspect. Perhaps you can speak to that a little bit, around the fact that parents, mums and dads, do feel kind of difficult feelings sometimes. They feel upset with babies. They struggle sometimes to be with a crying baby. Being with a crying baby, for example, can be really, really hard, and very stressful, and can bring up feelings of anger and hatred even sometimes. So maybe if you could just chat a little bit about how normal is that? Yeah.
Well, I think society makes those feelings quite difficult sometimes, because the picture of the mother is of kind of always present, always calm, always has it together. But we know that, in fact, normal mothers feel a normal range of feelings, that sometimes there's love and connection and warmth, and at other times there's frustration and even anger. I mean, some mothers even talk about hatred as being just in the mix, that I hate that you kept me up all night, but you smiled at me this morning, and I feel love for you as well. That it can be incredibly normal, but also often quite hard to talk about, when moms have different kinds of feelings, that in fact that's pretty normal.
And so when is that kind of more worrying, though? What would it look like if a mom's negative feelings towards her baby were less helpful, given that
Right.
negative feelings are actually quite normal?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the kind of, certainly as a psychologist that does a lot of work with moms, I start to get a little bit worried when there isn't the full range of different kinds of experiences and emotions, when sometimes it can be playful and sometimes you're frustrated and sometimes you're cross and and other times there's pleasure. I start to get worried when the overwhelming feeling is that of either frustration or anger or sometimes numbness even. And that's when it starts to edge over into this kind of field where we talk about kind of postnatal depression, where moms find it very hard sometimes to feel anything positive towards their babies. They know that they should, and there's often a whole lot of blame and guilt. But in fact, they find it very hard to feel pleasure from their babies. And I think because of that, it's often very difficult for them to form an attachment, a bond with their babies. And those are the things that I think start to become more worrying and also start to have a detrimental impact to babies' development and to babies' brain.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? So why is postnatal depression really an emergency for babies? I mean, for mums too, I guess, but why is it also an emergency for babies?
Well, if we think, I mean, just speaking about speaking back to the idea of the relationships and what you experience in your first few years actually helps build your brain, that there's been a huge amount of research to the fact that what babies need is reciprocity, a sense that I do something and I get a response from the person kind of looking at me or interacting with me. It may not always be the response I want, but I get a response and that it becomes two ways, right? So I interact and I do something and then you respond and then I respond to you, and that's really how the relationship develops. But if you think about a mom who's depressed, very often she's got quite a still face, and her responses to her baby are often very little. And not only is there very little pleasure, but often there's a kind of missing of cues, a missing of that kind of, they talk about a dance that happens between moms and babies. They did a whole lot of experiments. They called them the still face experiments, where they took moms and they asked them to interact with their babies, and then they asked them to have a kind of very serious, still blank face. And they showed on video, they captured on video, within quite quick time, how dysregulating that became for babies. Babies who previously were smiling and singing and pointing suddenly started to cry and to try and get mom's attention. And then when that doesn't work, what they found is those babies then started to find other ways to cope, sometimes dissociating, sometimes. So it becomes very, very damaging to babies' development when on an ongoing basis, the person that you're wanting to interact with isn't responding and also isn't helping you then with what you feel.
I guess in a way it's like they are walking or creating quite dangerous pathways through that felt, if we use that analogy. They are starting to learn that they need to walk quite a dangerous way through the felt, and they might tend to use that same dangerous route as they grow up.
Absolutely. And if you think about someone who's learned to cut off from what they feel because it's too scary, it's too frightening when you're a baby, that person later, many years later, is most likely to use those same defenses when she's stressed or when he's in a situation that doesn't feel very comfortable, rather than seeking out support and help. Because really what they've learned is that I can't look to you to help me with what I'm feeling. So I have to make another plan. And that plan's not always so helpful, especially later on.
Yeah.
And I think that also, they talk about relational trauma that happens in the context of a relationship, which is really what we're speaking about. But maybe if we take that kind of one step further. And I know, Nikki, this is an area that you have quite a lot of experience with, is really what happens to a baby when they're in a situation that not only is the person not comforting them, but the person that's meant to be taking care of them is actually frightening them. Maybe you can speak us through a little bit about what happens in those circumstances. And if we think, I know it's Child Abuse Week, and we think about babies who maybe grow up in homes where there is domestic violence or where there is things that are rather frightening. Does it matter? Are babies aware of those kinds of experiences? And maybe you can kind of talk us through how it impacts them.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think so often people think that babies are probably the most kind of protected from violence in the home, or even kind of child abuse experiences, that they probably, that people say things like they won't remember them. Um, or that the babies aren't really so kind of aware of what's going on around them if people are screaming or shouting or hitting or bleeding or whatever. But actually, it's quite the opposite. I guess they won't probably have a conscious memory. They won't remember like how we remember the first day we went to school. But they will remember in terms of the fact that their brain will be being wired in relation to this experience. And it will stay with them in a much deeper way, actually. It will stay with them in the way that their brain is being wired and set up. And so that's what's so risky about this. I mean, of course, child abuse at any age, or domestic violence around children at any age, has profound effects on children. But babies are particularly vulnerable because their brains, these areas of their brains, are being wired, as we were saying, during this time. So the thing is, and also, as you say, if the very person who's supposed to be kind of comforting you is also the person that's scary for you, that really confuses kind of your ability to calm and soothe, because we as humans are kind of wired instinctively to seek comfort from our primary caregiver. And if that person is scaring us, even if it's because they're shouting at somebody else, not even at us, and they're causing our emotions to kind of get big and overwhelming, then they are a very confusing person for us. And so we don't have anyone really that can make us feel better and can kind of teach us these important skills that we need to learn so early in life about calming down. So the impact of kind of abuse and violence around babies is huge, even though they won't remember it like a memory of an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old remembers the day before. They will remember it actually in a particularly damaging way, in that their brain is wired kind of around that experience.
And I think earlier you were talking about kind of our stress response systems, how we, our thresholds for what and how we respond to stressful situations. I mean, and we know that physiologically, the kind of chemicals that get secreted in our body or produced when there are extremely tense, frightening situations also sets us up, for particular kinds of stress response systems throughout our life. As you say, even if you don't have a memory that you can recall and kind of bring to life later.
I think one of the most kind of profound effects of this are that people really remember, not consciously, but remember kind of their baby experiences when they are parenting. And I guess what we mean by remember is that they kind of relive them or recreate them often. So we know that often the experiences that people had when they were a baby, they kind of pass that on to their babies through being with their babies in the same way, because the parts of their brain that teach them about how to be in relationships are the same parts you use when you're the baby in the relationship and when you're the mother or the father in the relationship, if that makes sense. So in a way, these experiences can stay not just with the person throughout their life, but can get passed on to the next generation and the next generation, because it affects how they parent.
Right. So in fact, I mean, the real danger of abuse is that it isn't just what's happening now, but that person, unless they really seek out support and kind of work through, are much more likely to get into those same kind of dangerous and abusive situations and to expose their children to them later on.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, how we often come to see abuse really running in families across generations, and people kind of finding themselves, marrying somebody that might have been a bit like their father was towards their mother, for example, because of this exact thing about how our brain gets wired about relationships from so young.
Okay, well, I mean, certainly I know that Nikki and I find this incredibly interesting and important information, and we hope that in Child Abuse Week that it can be incredibly informative, and certainly for parents, but maybe also professionals and people that are making the policies that help protect children.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay. Cheers.